Well, I think we can start. It is, first of all, it's my great pleasure to have here with us Professor Imer Flores, an old friend for a long time. We have been exchanging comments, texts, and experiences for a long time. So it's really a pleasure. I'm very glad to hear you, Imer, who's going to talk about constructive interpretation, democracy, and the Protestant attitude. Yeah, and today we have the privilege to have Veronica Blanco and Conrado Hubener and such a qualified audience here. So I'm really glad for this. And for those of you who are not so well acquainted with Imer's resume, just real brief notes. Since the conference is being online, streamed online. So Professor Imes is a professor at UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, which is the most important institution in Mexico and one of the best in Latin America for sure. He had his LLM at Harvard Law School. He's a PhD at UNAM. He was a visiting researcher and professor at Georgetown University, and he was also professor at CTLS, Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London. And he was a former Fulbright scholar, among many other qualifications. And he is a well-known constitutional theorist and also a well-known legal philosopher. Has written extensively of many issues connected especially with the work of Dworkin, even though not exclusively on Dworkin, as he amended me some minutes ago. So I don't want to take your time. I'd like to, the floor is yours, Imer. It's really a great pleasure to have you here once again.
Thank you, Ronaldo. Muito obrigado for your kind words. It's also a pleasure for me to be here in the Universidad de São Paulo in the Facultad de Direito for yet another time, once again. So I guess that means that I have not doing it that bad. So I keep getting invited. It's very nice to see also Daniel and of course Conrado, João Victor, and new faces and new friends, and of course Veronica, which is, as we were already mentioning, she's out of context. We usually meet in Mexico or in the UK. So it's, and we were remembering a very nice anecdote of one of the University of Surrey Law Center's early events with Charles Fried from Harvard. So, which is also a professor of, and Ronaldo also knows very well, because Ronaldo was a very enthusiastic of contract law. And I remember that Contract as Promise was made, of course, that's one of the books of Charles Fried. And he acknowledges Roberto Mangabeira for the notes that he gave him to make the book. So that's something we were talking in the morning, and let me just share to Veronica that we use the word curriculum for the courses you are going to be teaching and so on. And in Mexico, we make this distinction of the curriculum that is taught and it's explicit, which is pensum, and the curriculum usually people talk about the hidden curriculum, the culto, so. And I was just in a meeting yesterday and in a discussion in a conference, and someone pointed the importance of the living curriculum, what you actually do about your studies. So as we were saying in the morning, part of the studies is having friends with whom you interact and keep interacting throughout the year. So I'm glad to have very good friends in the audience. But don't be deceived. They are very critical. They are always pushing me. That's another reason why I'm very grateful for all your help. Today, I would like to read from a paper which is already published. I think the discussion on this topic is going on and will be going on. Let me put it into context. Nowadays, in Mexico, we experience a very regretful constitutional reform on the judicial reform. starting on this coming June 1st, we will be electing all the judges, magistrates, and even justices of the Supreme Court. And magistrates includes the electoral magistrates. So it's completely nonsense. It's a threat to judicial independence, to impartiality, and so on. So, but the context, the political context, makes it very difficult for the Inter-American Human Rights Court to overrule that, because Mexico will easily treat, well, I will be the second Venezuela, and I will leave the system. So that's said, it's how does the law works? And I have the feeling that this was a discussion that was triggered by me commenting on a paper of Winshiat Lee, a colleague from Wake Forest University in the U.S., also a member of the Aminta Field and the IBR. So he was somehow he liked the idea of the Dworkin's Protestant attitude. There has been some critics. Thomas Bustamante, Gerald Posteman. Well, Thomas not that critical. Gerald Posteman being much critical, and Thomas more or less defending the Dworkin's position. The curious thing, as I will be reading this, and you will notice, is that, but this is very typical of Dworkin. Dworkin only used the Protestant attitude in the Lost Empire. But I am sure that this idea of the attitude, whichever label you want to put it, is throughout his works. So the fact that I used this, it was kind of in replying to Winshiat, who has worked on the Protestant attitude, and I think that's just to give you an idea. Of course, this is very into Dworkin's constructive interpretation, the idea of democracy, and as I was already hinting in the morning, to the fact that I think that in a democracy, there are no final words, and that everything is and will be revised. So in some sense, this was prepared just after Dobbs was decided in the US, so making the hope that somehow at some point it will be possible to reverse Dobbs and return to something like Roe. Of course, politics, and you have to probably change first the justices of the Supreme Court in the US and let the criteria change throughout the years. But that, I think that's a good news. And also because in the case of the judicial reform in Mexico, Ronaldo was asking in the morning, how possible, or is it possible to be reformed soon? And I don't think it will be very soon, but that's what I think will fit into this discussion. So I think that the text is growing and maturing properly with the time. So that's something I'm very happy of this one. So let me go through the text, and I will be reading in English. Sorry. Adopting a Protestant attitude to law and seeing what appears to be settled as unsettled. Adopting a Protestant attitude to law and seeing what appears to be settled as unsettled are not necessarily problematic. It is quite the opposite. It is a proper way not only of discharging one's duty to obey the law by critically following its authority, displaying fidelity, and exhibiting integrity, but also by identifying and correcting previous mistakes, or even making new ones with the full possibility of revising and correcting them. After this introductory section, I will commence by reviewing another reading of Dworkin Protestantism, and will focus on one of the aspects that some find problematic, mainly the implication of this approach for democracy. As Winshiat Lee suggests, I quote him, "The Protestant attitude is a double-edged sword. Its potential of not leaving any law settled is quite troubling." I will continue by revising three aspects of Ronald Dworkin's theory to clarify my own position and to respond to alternative readings, such as Lee's and Postema's, by suggesting that despite the fact that the Protestant attitude appears to be a double-edged sword, which might yield good and bad results, it is not problematic, especially for those of us who, following Dworkin, advocate for both a constructive interpretation and a partnership conception of democracy. I will conclude by briefly revisiting George Orwell's Animal Farm as a way of reinforcing why Jeremy Waldron's critique of stronger versions of judicial review is misled. In a democracy, there are no final words, and neither the legislature nor the judge nor any other legal official has, and much less should have, that last word. Albeit there are still right answers, and judges, despite not being the only ones, are most of the time better suited to reach them due to their independence from ordinary day-to-day politics. Please note that this last line was written before of that time. The most outstanding features of liberal constitutionalism as a limited government under a constitution includes the determination of the liberties and rights of the people and the division of power among the different branches of government. These features, if accompanied both with judges' independence and strong judicial review, enable the courts to be the guardian of the Constitution. Since most of the challenges to our liberal constitutional democracies come from inside, the response must also come from inside, and not surprisingly, judges are better suited to resolve disputes and to respond to those threats, as well as to keep powers not only separated, but also checked and balanced. In short, to safeguard the individual minorities and even governmental bodies threatened by the force of majoritarian politics and from elected officials who will not only turn out to be autocrats, but also tend to exceed their powers. As we will see, law is not exhausted by a catalog of rules and its justifying principles, but requires an argumentative, constructive, interpretative, self-reflective, and even fraternal attitude, which Dworkin labeled in Law's Empire as Protestant. To suggest that citizens, judges, and other legal officials as partners in self-government must be critical of what appears to be settled law. Instead of blindly following its authority, they must interpret it by themselves to figure out what law really is and not inventing new law. Another reading of Dworkin Protestantism. Lee correctly claims in both his current and previous accounts of Dworkin Protestantism about law that what Dworkin calls the Protestant attitude has the potential of seeing settled law as unsettled, and so requiring the citizens and judges, as well as legislators and other legal officials, must adopt the Protestant attitude, not only to be critical of the prevailing account of law, but also to be willing to interpret and reinterpret it by themselves. However, as already advanced, although the Protestant attitude towards law advocated by Dworkin may appear to be a double-edged sword, which can certainly yield Roe and even Dobbs, I reject the view that its potential of not leaving any law settled is quite troubling. After the U.S. Supreme Court overturning of Roe with Dobbs, the Protestant attitude might be our last hope, either to show that Dobbs was in fact a mistake and that it should be overturned, or to challenge the constitutionality either of the federal or state legislature abortion ban, which will criminalize women and neglect their right to decide to interrupt a pregnancy. Imagine that Congress or a given state legislature enacts an absolute abortion ban and consider whether a woman, an obstetrician, or someone else will be able to challenge the statute or even practice civil disobedience. I further agree not only that citizens and judges, but also legislators and legal officials, in the process of fulfilling their duty to obey the law, must figure out what the law is instead of merely following it. Therefore, I also accept the implication of the Protestant attitude towards law for a citizen's political obligation, that is, their duty to obey the law. Although certain kinds of actions are implied by the Protestant attitude, including civil disobedience, which is paradoxically a proper way of obeying the law, I am not sure, well, let me just suggest that we are obeying the law by disobeying the law, making it sure that you understand what the law says and you are disagreeing to follow in that sense and put it into another word. I'm not sure that it is that as Lisa suggests, civil disobedience is required. Requires citizens commit that kind of civil disobedience is that it is the proper way of discharging one's duty to obey the law, because as he acknowledges, that might be also be too demanding of citizens. I will return to this point below to suggest a friendly amendment. What is required is not to disobey, but to critically determine whether to obey or disobey what appears to be the settled law. Indeed, in Law's Empire, Dworkin emphasizes a Protestant attitude toward the law and mentions it only 3 times in the book, but with the implications of utmost importance. Let me just show my footnote. For those reasons, I will characterize the Protestant attitude as the 3 times a lady thesis: lady authority, lady fidelity, and lady integrity. Though Dworkin does not say very much about it as elsewhere, as law affirms, it is quite clear that it is a doctrine central to his overall theory of law as integrity. So yes, it's present all over Dworkin's. It is worth mentioning that Dworkin labeled and relabeled his theory many times, and not surprisingly, the Protestant attitude appears under different names: argumentative, constructive, interpretive, fraternal, and self-reflective attitudes throughout law's empires. The last four in the last paragraph, but remain at the core of his account of law, which was finally recharacterized as law as interpretivism. After distinguishing between two principles of political integrity, a legislative principle which asks lawmakers to try to make the total set of laws moral coherent, and an adjudicative principle which instructs the law be seen as a coherent in that way, Dworkin suggests that integrity expands and deepens the role individual citizens can play in developing the public standards of their community, because it requires them to treat relations among themselves as characteristically, not just spasmodically, governed by these standards. Immediately after, Dworkin alludes to the Protestant attitude as Protestant idea for the first time. I start quoting Dworkin. For the expressive value is confirmed when people in good faith try to treat one another in a way appropriate to the common membership in a community, governed by political integrity, and to see each other as making this attempt, even when they disagree about exactly what integrity requires in particular circumstances. Political obligation is then not just a matter of obeying the discrete political decisions of the community one by one, as political philosophers usually represent it, it becomes a more Protestant idea. Fidelity to a scheme of principle each citizen has a responsibility to identify, ultimately for himself, as his community's scheme. As Lee acknowledges, Dworkin's Protestantism about law has two elements, which seem to challenge the authority of law, that is, its authoritative nature. On the one hand, every citizen has to interpret the law for herself in discharging her duty to obey the law. That includes judges too, in discharging the duty to apply the law in deciding cases. On the other hand, it is clear that what the law is, or one might say what the law really is, in relation to a particular case, is in principle always up to interpretation. And even if an authoritative account by a court decision or a legislative act has already been given. Furthermore, if what law really is always up to interpretation, then clearly one cannot blindly follow authorities, so to speak, in order to discharge one's obligation to obey the law. Thus, taking authority seriously means not following it blindly, but figuring out critically what the law in fact is as a matter of interpretation, and as such, not merely as providing peremptory or exclusionary reasons for action, but by adopting Hart's critical reflective attitude or John Rawls' reflective equilibrium. I see one question coming. Although I agree that citizens must put forward their dissenting interpretations of the law to be tested by the courts, and civil disobedience is a great example. That is, one appears to disobey a law, but in fact one is obeying the law by adopting what law calls a Protestant obedience. Nevertheless, I would like to introduce my friendly amendment. Citizens must critically not only put forward the dissenting interpretation by disobeying a law or even objecting it as a matter of conscientious refusal, but also by challenging its content, including precedents in a court, and even by promoting an initiative to make a new law, an amendment, or reform in the legislative arena. In sum, by challenging the prevailing account of law, citizens and legal officials reinforce its authority, not by following it literally or mechanically, but by figuring out what law's authority really allows or requires, confers or imposes, permits or prohibits. Certainly, they must provide additional reasons to debunk the prevailing account and replace it with a different interpretation, very much like the way precedents work. In other words, what is required is not to disobey the law itself, but to critically determine whether the best way to obey the law is by following what appears to be settled law, or disobey it by appealing to a higher law or its purposive end, including rules and its justifying principles. The second time that Dworkin mentions the Protestant attitude, he affirms that it is the attitude favored by his notion of integrity. But let me suggest that the passage also reinforces the importance of fidelity to law, because both citizens and judges, as well as legislators and other legal officials, not only must interpret the law, but also must do it within practical boundaries. Let me quote Dworkin again. Dividing departments of law to match that sort of opinion promotes predictability and guards against sudden official reinterpretations that uproot large areas of law. And it does this in a way that promotes a deeper aim of law as integrity. If legal compartments make sense to people at large, they encourage the Protestant attitude integrity favors, because they allow ordinary people, as well as hard-pressed judges, to interpret the law within practical boundaries that seem natural and intuitive. Following Longfuller's distinction between intelligent and unintelligent fidelity, the fidelity that Dworkin advocates resembles the former and not the latter. The latter is associated with a more literal or textual approach to the law, deferent to whatever the authority has already enacted as law, whereas the former with a more interpretive or purposive approach to law, which requires, as Dworkin suggests, fidelity to a scheme of principles. As Liz argues, not only courts do not have the best word, as Lisa argues, not only courts do not have the best word on what the law is, even if they have the last word, but also legislators does not have the best word on the law either, even as they engage in the making of it. So even after the legislature has legislated on a certain issue, it is still a matter of interpretation for the courts as well as ordinary citizens, as to determine what the law is on that issue. Keep in mind Fuller's assertion. The correction of obvious legislative errors or oversights is not to supplant the legislative will, but to make it effective. The third and last time that Dworkin refers to the Protestant attitude, he does it twice under Protestant and 4 more times with other words, such as constructive, fraternal, interpretive, and self-reflective. This is in the last paragraph of the last section of the epilogue to What is Law, on the last chapter, Law Beyond Law, of Law's Empire. Basically, go and read the last line, the last paragraph. What is law? Law is not exhausted by a catalog of rules or principles, each with its own dominion over some discrete theater of behavior, nor by any roster of officials and their powers, each over part of our lives. Law's empire is defined by attitude, not territory or power or process. It is an interpretative, self-reflective attitude addressed to politics in the broadest sense. It is a Protestant attitude that makes each citizen responsible for imagining what his society's public commitments to principles are and what these commitments require in new circumstances. The Protestant character of law is confirmed and the creative role of private decisions acknowledged by the backward-looking judgmental decisions, and also by the regulative assumptions that the judges must have the last word. Their word is not for that reason the best word. Law's attitude is constructive. It aims in the interpretive spirit to lay principles over practice to show the best route to a better future, keeping the right's faith with the past. It is finally a fraternal attitude, an expression of how we are united in a community, though divided in project, interest, and conviction. That is, anyway, what law is for us, for the people we want to be and the community we aim to have. This lengthy paragraph insists on the importance of citizens and judges, as well as other legal officials, adopting a Protestant attitude by themselves as a way not only of contesting the authority of law, but also of displaying an intelligent fidelity to law, which is favored by Dworkin's conception of integrity to law as coherence, that is, fit and justification. Additionally, it includes a caveat. Though judges must have the last word, their word is not for that reason the best word. This suggests not only that sometimes citizens, judges, and other legal officials, even if they claim to adopt the Protestant attitude, fail to reach the best or right answers and do commit mistakes, as in Dobbs, where the court was inventing new law rather than interpreting the existing one, but also that such mistakes must be corrected, as Brown did with Plessy. Basically, the rest of the paper goes into revisiting Dworkin's constructive interpretation, but I think that's I can skip that and let me go directly to the conclusion so we can open the floor to the discussion. To conclude, as a way of reinforcing that adopting the Protestant view and seeing settled law as unsettled are not necessarily problematic, let me quote a passage of George Orwell's Animal Farm. None of the other animals on the farm could get further than the letter A. It was also found that the stuppier animals, such as the sheep, hens, and dogs, were unable to learn the 7 commandments by heart. After much thought, Snowball declared that the 7 commandments could in fact be reduced to a single maxim, namely, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. This, he said, contained the essential principle of animalism. Whoever had thoroughly grasped it will be safe from human influences. The birds at first objected, since it seemed to be them that they also had 2 legs. But Snowball proved to them that this was not so. In a few words, 1. A general constitutive assembly, that is, of animals, had enacted a constitution, the 7 commandments. 2. An authority, that is, Snowfell, exercising a secondary rule of legislation or change, proceeded to amend or reform it by declaring that the 7 commandments can be reduced to one single maxim: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. A class, fraction, or group, the birds, acknowledging that they have 2 legs and wondering whether they are bad for that reason, objected the content of the new rule. And 4, an authority, that is Snowball again, but now exerting a secondary rule of adjudication, overruled their objection, proving them wrong, and upholding the one single maxim. However, I'm not convinced that the last adjudicative decision, regardless of being authoritative, is the right one. That is, despite having 2 legs, the birds were excluded from the application of the one single maxim. If we adopt the Protestant attitude, we will have to critically keep interpreting it to determine if the birds were rightfully excused or not. Let me suggest that the essential principle of animalism requires the recognition, sooner or later, of an additional qualification to exempt the birds. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, with the exception of feathery animals, or even 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, if accompanied by 2 hands with opposable thumbs. From my point of view, the morals of this part of the Orwellian fable are: what appears to be a final word is not infallible but fallible, as all human endeavors or animal ones. Furthermore, what seems to be a last word is not definitive, but tentative. In other words, what is settled for a time being remains unsettled over time and can be revised later by adopting the Protestant attitude, not only by citizens but also by legal officials, in their different capacities as legislators, judges, and so on. According to law and the duties imposed and powers conferred upon them, in some, there are no final or last words in law, especially in a democracy, where everyone is entitled to have, say, framers, amenders, legislators, judges, other legal officials, and especially the citizens, if we are committed to pursue a true democratic citizenship of partners in self-government, who for that reason must adopt the Protestant attitude. The people then, now, and forevermore. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Imer, for your thought-provoking presentations. Well, I have some questions, but I'd like to postpone them and open to the floor to make your comments. And if you want to do so, please use the mic and say your name. And yeah, we have.
Hi, hello. My name is Daniel. I'm a fixed-term lecturer here. Many thanks for a lecture, Professor Himer. I think the last time I saw you was like 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So it's great to see you again. So my question is more or less the same kind of question I asked Veronica yesterday, but on a different score. I think that your paper highlights that one of Dworkin's greatest contributions to legal theory was the fact that he introduced an explanation of how we can make sense of disagreements in law. Even if a Supreme Court gets it wrong, we can say that, well, I think the Supreme Court got the law wrong, even if we can understand that why, we can also say that what the Supreme Court decided is the law, even if I understand that they got it wrong. So Dworkin introduced that. And this is possible thanks to the Protestant attitude, which I think is one of Dworkin's greatest contribution. And my question to you is connected to that, and it's more or less the following one. Given that Dworkin puts a lot of emphasis on the third chapter of Law's Empire, on his general concept of law as some sort of justified coercion, of how we can justify the use of state power against citizens. This justification, which comes in terms of interpretation, in terms of the interpretive Protestant attitude, tends to be more controversial and more difficult to be accepted by the audience, the one I am constraining. If I am the judge, the one I'm constraining, this justification tends to be less and less acceptable by this audience, the more controversial it gets. And in terms of political communities such as the US or Brazil, I think Mexico as well, in which you have deep divisions within society, within different forms of life and traditions and so on and so forth, it makes very, very difficult for any kind of justification to be able to get through all the audiences. And then I wonder, I would like to hear a bit more, if you believe that there might be a tension between, on the one hand, Dworkin's idea of Protestant attitude of trying to make the best possible sense of law and trying to formulate the best justification I can for the use of state power on the one hand, and on the other hand, what Dworkin sometimes refers to as fraternity or a fraternal attitude, which presupposes that in a way or another we are more or less committed with a sort of common future or common ground or common projects, which might not be the case. Those two ideas, fraternity and Protestant attitude, they might actually be putting pressure to different sides. I'm not sure if that was clear. I would like to listen to you a bit more on this point, which is basically more or less the same question I made Veronica yesterday regarding the common good. So I would like to hear a bit more on this. Thank you very much.
Please.
Yeah.
So let me start by pointing out that part of the errors and mistakes and reinforcing that, because I tend to have the feeling that, okay, that also has a tension with one right answers. And I will say no. And it seems to me that since we are criticizing a decision of the court and we are saying they got it wrong, we have to have somewhere a blueprint of which was the right way of getting it. And I'm not suggesting that I'm always right and they are always wrong, but that there's something, if we adopt the Protestant attitude, it will be easier to reach which one is that one, and not the fact that it is already settled being the only reason to suggest that's the reason. No, and I see that goes to your second question or comment on the coercion. If we are going to be changing which is the rule today, and it changes for tomorrow. So that's I see the problem with that idea of not being stable, of losing some sort of certainty and security. But as I said, what I think to be the idea of the Protestant attitude is that even if the judge will have to decide and get it wrong or right, he will be setting the law for that time, not for over time, not for the rest of the time. So I think that's, again, another point in which it is good to have this possibility of revising previous decisions to correct them. If not, we will still have Plessy, to name only one, which I think was wrongly decided in 1896 and was correctly decided in 1954. But the law was basically the same in 1896 and 1954. What changed? The amendments were already there. What changed? There was two world wars, and the US were sending African Americans to the wars. So now we have to be more coherent and congruent with, but that's also Protestant attitude. We realized that we were getting it wrong. So of course, if we are going to be coercing people, I would like to have the right reasons for coercing people. And as a citizen, we are entitled to ask them to provide those good reasons. So I know those two were more like comments, but I think they are good to also to explicit more what I have in mind. And that leads me to your third question, to your question properly. So I tend to think that, and I sometimes hear that people criticize Dworkin by, oh, he was so loose. He was very hard to grasp. He would always shift and move up from one place to another. So yes, somehow yes, because as I said, he mentioned Protestant only 3 times or 4 times in 3 different parts in one book, and he never mentions against Protestant attitudes in the rest of the work. So what I learned throughout the years was that he will not be fighting for the label that. He will be more committed to the idea behind that. So keep in mind that fraternal attitude, Protestant attitude, self-reflective attitude, critical attitude. So what is behind there is always this kind of, we need an attitude. We need something else. So I think that's the attitude of being willing to revise the decisions, not taking everything for granted, and be willing to. And again, if you are going to coerce people, we'll have to revise if we are getting the best arguments for coercing the people. And again, we can get mistakes, but that doesn't mean that there's not like one right answer at that point, given the information we have. And as I said, if Plessy was wrongly decided, the information was basically there. They didn't see it, or that they see it until 1954. I think it's only getting extra information to now get it right. So I think that more or less I respond to your concern. My feeling is that the Protestant fraternity is the same self-reflective, critical reflective. And let me just point out that in that sense, there's this nice connection, I think, with Hart and with even Rawls, in which both of them were at different points claiming that we needed some sort of critical reflective attitude, Hart, and the reflective equilibrium in Rawls. And keep in mind also, it was around the idea, in Rawls at least, in the idea of how we were going to construct the arguments to make the decisions and so on. In the case of Hart, I take the phrase, I like the critical reflective attitude. What I miss is that most of my positivist friends, including the exclusionary ones or the exclusivists, will not be willing to do that critical reflective attitude of revising the settled law, because it's already settled, and they will be willing to push it as settled instead of being willing to analyze if it deserves another revision. Thank you again, but I think that's the same attitude. Because we are partners in self-government, we are a fraternity, we need to make sure that we have the best arguments to coerce the others, because we can be coerced as well. So I think that's why I put it together.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very
Veronica.
much. Ime, as usual, very thought-provoking and fun as well at the same time. So a lot of things to think about. I think I agree with the spirit of what you are saying. So the importance of what is called the moral error in judicial decision cross-culturally, right? And also within a certain period of time. And I think that's what Dworkin can offer, as opposed to the positivist position. However, I wonder whether the theory is fully equipped to what you want. And that's about the Protestantism. So in the Protestant attitude, I understand that there is a constant process of reflection, but there is a principles over practices, as you well pointed out. But I think that because the principles are so abstract, they're always contestable at the same time, or they don't really play a role in the process of the common law in the following sense. So the greatest changes of certain core decision in the common law is the distinction rather than overruling. So when the judges, they are not saying actually that the past cases are wrong, but they are saying that this case is different. So they are creating a different practice that is not explained by the principles. The principle it's not a reinterpretation of principle. As you say, the law, it was always exactly the same. You know, it seems that there is an appearance of continuity, and the judge has to show that there is a continuity. And the distinguishing is because he's taking something, another aspect of the past practice, taking a value of the past practice and redirecting it. So to put it in a different vocabulary, that I don't want to use my vocabulary, but and I think that is different from the abstraction of the point of self-consciousness or self-reflection, because what you have with the Protestant attitude, you don't have community. It's just the individuals with the conscious. But the construction of the community is only through the practice, and that's the beauty of the common law. In the distinguishing, you have kind of a branches of different cases. There's no complete unity, but there are different views, different interpretations. And that's, I'm sorry to say, that's Catholic attitude. It's not Protestant attitude.
That is
A Catholic attitude, not the Protestant attitude. Just a
okay.
joke, yeah. But there's a truth in jokes.
Perfect. Let me react. The first part, you can imagine my reaction to Emer is thought-provoking and fun. Guilty as charged. I think legal philosophy has to be fun, as interesting. And you remember John Garner saying that that's where you're wrong. No, I'm right. It has to be interesting and fun, and we have to enjoy it, and of course, thought-provoking. So I take that as a compliment. I have the feeling that in the way of phrasing, and at the end with the reference to Catholic, I think that's the problem. That's the positivist response is something like we do not recognize that we were wrong before. It's that we are more or less now, we are deciding, we are pragmatic, we have now new elements, we can take new considerations, but not like revising that we were wrong before. And I think that we can do much better than that and really saying where we are getting things right and wrong. And at least that's what I take part of the Protestant attitude by distinguishing to the Catholic attitude, which I think is less critical, which I take is much less critical than the Protestant. And of course, one of the points is that in our Catholic tradition, we are more or less told what to believe and to follow. That's very, from my point of view, sounds very positivist, very exclusive positivism. Whereas the Protestant is, no, we need a constant revision of the practice and the principles that justify and so on. So I think that's the idea of the constant process of reflection. I think that's the core, I mean, of what Dworkin is somehow asking for. And I think that's Rawls as well. So I think there's, and I agree, it's always contestable. There will always be arguments back and forth, but at least putting them in this in this second moment over the table gives us the opportunity of figuring out who's getting it right and who is getting it wrong. And let me just point, because I noticed you got the mic. For instance, again with the example of the U.S. and the slavery, an originalist will keep saying that the Constitution originally never said something like that, so they can easily justify decisions in a different ways. Whereas the positivists will probably go and say Plessy was rightly decided at that point, and Brown was rightly decided another point. But again, I think that the shift between one and the other, and basically being the same case. And I say, I understand that it's not strictly the same case, and it was settled for in Plessy for the railroads, but then comes the education, and it changes even the railroads. So it's not that it's settled for railroads only. It goes and gets revised for all the process. So that's what I think it is important. to also to this idea of the mistakes, and that we are not only being pragmatic, saying we can decide this today, this tomorrow, this the next day, and so on. In that sense, being very Catholic, but to figure out the way why we have to follow it in one way or another. And as I said, just quickly to go back to the paper, so the proper way to obey the law is not merely following whatever people say is the law. It's really, I think, the proper way of obeying it is figuring out what the law is asking me to do. But I stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Can I come back?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I think we agree that moral truth is very important, right? And the method, what I'm trying to push you towards a different direction, because if moral truth is important, I'm saying the moral truth comes because it's a particular decision, is actually through the practice of the practical reason, in seeking the practical truth. And it's not through the abstract principles, because my problem with the Protestant attitude is that the last tribunal of truth is conscience, the particular individual conscience. So you lose the practice, you lose the community. So in a way, I think so what I'm trying to vindicate is the importance of the things we do together through the practice of thinking together. Now, and that comes again with the interest of following what the authority says, because the law is a unity of things. So you cannot have a contract or have property rights and say, but I'm not going to obey Dobbs, because you're undermining also the practice, what is the community of the legal understanding of the engagement with what is legal. So I think it's the Catholic in the sense, I don't think that anyone would say, oh, you have to obey the law because it's the law. No, you have to obey the law because it plays the function. It plays the function of a flourishing society. The rule of law is connected to ideas, to moral ideas. On that we agree completely. But I'm just questioning the tribunal of truth there, with the notion of principle, and you're inviting the citizen to question the particular decision. And I think that actually undermines the rule of law in a way, but also undermines that you have contracts, that you have properties, you have some basic laws that you're taking advantage, but you are not following all the decisions that you think, because this is exactly reflect an anomaly on this kind of Protestant attitude that is only about the conscience of the individual.
Yeah, but let me try. There's one of the parts in which I read, in which I tried to connect a little more on the individual and the community. And it also brings to me, for instance, Will Swallow work, where when he comes with, we have to figure out which is the community's constitutional morality. So what we were supposed to have been to already agree. And Dworkin has this line that I quoted, that even if we disagree on how to go, we more or less we agree on the broader idea, in the more abstract principle or commitment. So I think we tend to think of Dworkin as thinking in individual terms, but actually I think he was also doing the work for the community. And of course, each one of us as individuals will have to do the work, but it's throughout these discussions with others that we'll figure out the community as a whole, which one is the better one. So I know I still believe very much on the abstract principles, and I will be going back to that idea. So I'm not sure how to respond without going back to that. Because I have the feeling that it's still abstract. It's the attitude to be willing to keep doing this constant reflection of going back and forth and figuring out if that's the best justification. and so on. So that's what I take it. But I think, and as far as you understand, I don't have to go to get rid of the abstract principles, because I think they're still very connected to the practice. And curiously enough, this whole attitude is completely into the idea of the practice. We need a practice that is willing to revisit this instead of a practice that is just following the rule. So that's what I guess what I would say on that.
Yeah, Dworkin talks about a community of principles, but I don't think that is possible because principles are abstract and empty. Yeah, that's the one we disagree. Yeah.
If you allow me to jump in this wonderful discussion, I'd just like to make my comment on this point. I think that whenever a lot of ink has been spent on discussing what is Protestant interpretation and what is Dworkin's take on Protestant interpretation and Protestant attitude. I think that, in my view, Dworkin is just stressing one dimension of it. We don't have, I mean, the label Protestant interpretation, according to my own interpretation of Dworkin's work, merely wants to stress that an opposition with a Catholic attitude, that's for sure. Yeah, I think that's what's in his mind. And what is what is revolutionary in the Protestant attitude, in Luther's attitude? I think it's we shouldn't take the word of the Pope or the priests as the sole right official interpretation of the Holy Bible. So all citizens, all people should read the Bible, and they can have a reading of the Bible directly. So that's the whole Protestant attitude towards reading the Bible, printing the Bible, and giving education for citizens to read the Bible. So you have to have a conversation directly with the words of God. Okay, so this is the attitude. Instead of simply believing in what the Pope said as the infallible word about the God's will, we should read the Bible and the words of the God. Okay, so I think this is a metaphor. So what's he willing to say here? I mean, of course, Dworkin comes with a package of how to interpret reconstructive interpretation or interpretive contrasted with interpretative interpretation, whatever. There are many labels for this. Law's integrity. I mean, a lot of new concepts come inside this. But I think that what he's really willing to emphasize when he uses this metaphor, and I think it's an analogy, is basically that, I mean, the first attitude of the interpreter of law is unavoidably Protestant, as much as the believer in God should have also a Protestant attitude. I mean, instead of simply saying, well, the Constitution says that because the Supreme Court says that this is the correct and only meaning of the Constitution, you have to interpret not only the Constitution, but the whole legal materials that is at disposal. So I think we shouldn't overinterpret, I mean, the metaphor, I think, the metaphor of Protestant interpretation. So if we take this in this kind of minimalist understanding of what is to be a Protestant, having a Protestant attitude, I think that a lot of things that has been said in order to critique Dworkin's position could sound a little bit misplaced. Habermas, for example, made a similar critique, saying that, well, interpretation is a shared practice, is not something that can be done by the individual alone. We are not monads in the world, so it makes no sense to think that the practice of interpreting can exist inside the mind of the interpreter. So the kind of reaction comes together with the accusation of Dworkin sharing some kind of mentalist approach to interpretation, as if interpretation could be something like you could make alone, outside of your shared form of life, of a shared understanding of many things. So, and I think this is a kind of, in my view, a little bit artificial kind of criticism, because in this point, I think I'm more in line with what Ima said. I think what Dworkin is saying something that is less committed to such metaphysical understandings, which I think he clearly denies in other parts of his work. He's merely saying that, well, this is not to say that, for example, a Protestant, when he reads the Bible, that he cannot not only talk, discuss theological interpretation of the Holy Bible, and also this is not to deny that in order even to understand the words in which the Bible is written, this is a shared practice, of course. I mean, you have to share some conventions, some common understandings before you read. I mean, you cannot learn a language by your own. There is no private language. I mean, this is a Wittgensteinian point. I mean, I think Dworkin is not challenging this. I mean, the idea that impossibility of a private language. So at this point, in this sense, of course, I mean, interpretation is always a social practice. So to stress that all Dworkin is trying to say that interpretation could be made by someone alone and outside, and as if he was anti-social or outside society, it's a correct criticism, but I think this is the point when it's targeted towards Dworkin. This is not what he's saying. I mean, this is to take the metaphor further, too far, more than it's makes sense to be. I mean, he's not committed to any kind of mentalist approach in which the personal understanding would be the definite or the final word about, so as if he was a kind of postmodernist, as if we could always have some personal interpretation of whatever. Of course, this will bring some kind of full instability. This is not interpretation at all. This is chaos. This is the impossibility of communication. This is comes at least at the limit to the impossibility of any kind of interpretation. So, of course, authority plays a role. Of course, I mean, what priests say, and even what the Pope says, may play a role. He might be a very influent theologian. He might have theories about what is the best interpretation of the Holy Bible. So a Protestant or someone who is not Protestant, but who is aligned with the Protestant attitude could come to arrive to the conclusion that the Catholic or the Pope's interpretation is the best one. So this is not to say that he's alone. And this is not to deny that there are some authorities that play an important role. I think he's simply saying that some kind of individual attitude towards the legal materials is somehow unavoidable. And besides, I don't think that, I think that what he says, and this is the second point, what he says about interpretation relates not only to the legal institutional materials of law, but relates to anything that could be meaningful in our interpretation of what the law is, including our social attitudes, I mean, reactions, fears, everything could come, like, for example, our feeling of rejection, our feeling of repulse to some cruelty, for example. This is part of the legal material that has to be taken into consideration whenever we interpret the law. And finally, this is a point we are discussing the other day. I don't think that Dworkin has ever been committed to a thesis that sometimes is assigned to him, which is to say that our attitudes towards law is always requires interpretation. I mean, Dworkin, of course, he says a famous passage quotation that law is an interpretive practice. But this is different than saying that the law, the practice of law, is always dependent on the, let's say, the intellectual practice of interpreting the law. Sometimes this could happen. Sometimes this is a requirement. But we usually follow the law, follow a rule. When we stop in a traffic light, we don't interpret the traffic light. We are simply trained to do so. We are, in a way, trained like the Pavlov's dog. So we don't have to think that there is always the need of some kind of mental interpretation. And I think this is mistakenly assigned to him, because at least I don't think this is the best interpretation of his own ideas, and even less the most, the richest, let's say, interpretation of what we can do with his ideas. Even if he had said so, which I deny, I don't think so. I think this wouldn't be the best way to use his own ideas. Oh, sorry, this is my comment. So I think there's a lot of overinterpretation of what we should take Protestant attitude to mean.
Let me just react a little bit to the example of the stopping in the light. And of course, we all discuss or mention if following Fred Schauer, who, as you know, just passed away. The case of, I'm sure if it is Norway or somewhere, in which no matter what time, the people will be stopped at the light and wait, even if there are no cars in 100 miles around. They will stop and do not cross until it goes into green to walk. But of course, then again, we are talking about practices related to the communities. And of course, in Mexico, we have like a very, I'm going to say, but I think it's as in Sao Paulo, a code for stoplights and when to pass and when not to pass. And ours are related, and there are some other things. So in that sense, we are very Protestant in car driving, at least. But what I'm trying to suggest is that even if we take that example, I will say that we do interpret the traffic lights. At what hours will you be allowed to cross and what hours not? Other countries, I understand that they're very rigid on that. But being Latins, I have the feeling that we have that. But I'm not just saying that this is something of our communities, because you mentioned the cross-cultural thing. I think it's more than merely on and the example will in other countries will react very different to traffic lights or and so on. And I have a very long anecdote on this thing, and I can try to pull this example. I was in the US teaching. This was 2012, 2013. And then I was coming to the IBR in Belo Horizonte. That was also the summer of 2013. So this has to be summer of 2013, being in the US, in Washington, DC, and then coming to Brazil. In being in Washington, we wanted to take a walk through the mall. Through the mall being the monuments on Washington, D.C. And people will park around if they find the spot. There are not many spots, but if there's a spot, you can park there, and then you can walk around and be there for hours walking around. And there was a car with his blinkers. And I was like, are you going to leave this spot? Because this is what I dream about. And the guy was like, no, I'm waiting for the people from the insurance, because my car says like I have a low tire. And do you think the tire is low? I don't see it very low. I think you can drive to the gas station. But I was very honest and I said, but don't take my word, because I have a very nice interest in you getting away from here. So other than that I guess that's which are good and bad reasons. The people, cars were getting, as we were figuring out if he had to move or not, the cars were piling up. And then an officer came and he said, move on, move on. And I tried to talk him into my Protestant attitude on why we were discussing whether he will have to leave, whether it will be a good idea, and then I can park. And the police was completely into, no, it's the rule, it's the law, you have to move, you cannot park here, you have to move. So that was my US experience in this kind of thing. Then we have the ABR in Belo Horizonte, and then we went to give COP, well, that's 2013, as you were saying, Daniel. So we were first here in Sao Paulo, giving lectures, and then we went to Rio de Janeiro to give lectures after that. And it coincided with the visit of the Pope, now that we're talking about the Catholic attitudes. It was when he was just named Pope, and as you might remember, he was just named Pope, and he was giving this great speech in Rio de Janeiro about homosexuality and how should the court, the Catholic Church will have to open more. Then he was being the Protestant then, as I now recall the idea. But what I'm trying to say is that I was with Luis Duarte de Almeida, and we arrived to the airport, and I couldn't get to the Copacabana because that's where the speech was taking place, but he was in Ipanema, and we couldn't easily get the taxi to Ipanema. So we drove together, and then we walked down to Copacabana. We had dinner with friends there, but we were making hours, so I was able to go back to my hotel, which I wasn't able till really long hours after. And at some point, we in the taxi with my big bags, we were allowed to go and pass different blockades because my hotel is this one, my hotel is this one. But at some point, we reached a point in which the police stopped us and said, "No way, you're passing further than this. You have to walk." And I pointed to my bags and tried to talk to the officer on on letting me go into the closer that was possible. And he agreed, the policeman agreed, and he gave us the very Latin comment that only for this time, or only once. But again, I'm not trying to suggest that they are right and we are wrong, or we are wrong, or we are right and they are wrong. What I'm trying to suggest is the attitude on how we approach the law, on being so rigid that there's no way we are going to discuss this, or well, probably too flexible that we can discuss everything, but reaching somehow a middle ground point in which we are really trying to figure out, and that's the key part. Instead of the Catholic Church, which tends to say what you have to believe, the Protestant attitude suggests that we have each one to figure out what to do. But again, it seems to be, and I agree with Ronaldo and the reference to Habermas, that it has to be more into the shared practice, that we are all. So I think that trying to push Dworkin into suggesting that it is individuals, I think it is getting it wrong. Every member for each has to, because he also has the idea that this is a partnership conception of democracy. We are partners, we are associates in this. So we really need to figure out, both of us, what we have to do in this case. So I think my anecdotes were too long, but that's what I try to suggest that we have to figure out. And let me just add something about the three ladies, because I think the Protestant attitude reinforces the authority of law. That's something that we have to take very seriously, that we have a duty to obey, but not blindly obey by merely following, but obey by figuring out exactly what we have to do. So I think that's one. Of course, it goes into the idea of fidelity. So there's something, and then again, it goes back to the abstract principles of what how do you interpret those abstract principles? Is there the best way of doing that or not? And again, coherence seems to me like the delayed integrity being like the important part of not shifting all over the place, not allowing me and not allowing you, but being able to give a decision that is coherent. As again, taking the Plessy and Fair and Brown example, it's not coherent to say that this is separated but equal, and now we have to overrule over separated but equal. It's the same kind of decisions. So I think that's why the three parts of the Protestant attitude are important. So take authority seriously, try to figure out what that means by yourself and in the context of the community, because that's also the integrity. You'll have to figure out that this decision over time more or less stands because it's supported by most people for a long time, or there are doubts since early on. So we'll figure out. So I guess that's my reaction to your comment and to your concerns, and following also Veronica's.
Danielle?
Alive now. So I have a rather quick follow-up on this discussion, and I was wondering if there are not actually 2 or 3 different issues at stake in this discussion. What do I mean by that? I think that's one thing that works makes fairly clear in Lost Empire and Just for Hedgehog, so on and so forth, is that interpretive practices are social. We are actually joining some sort of tradition or practice. We are not inventing things anew in this sense. However, it is one thing to say that a practice is social, that we have a social shared practice of interpretation of the law, of the arts. This is one thing. It's another issue, however, the criteria of correction of my interpretation. And the criteria for the correction of interpretation, those might not be social or shared. And if those are not social or shared, then we can have, I think, properly speaking, a Protestant interpretation. However, and this is the point, which goes back to my first question. If this distinction between the criteria for the correction of the interpretation and the sharing of a practice, if those things are actually distinct, as I just mentioned, then this introduces a distinction between getting things right and getting things together. And this distinction is what I believe puts pressure on Dworkin's assimilation of the Protestant attitude of fraternity, which circles back to my first question. So it's one thing to say that we share the practice of interpretation. It's another thing to say that we share the same criteria for getting it right. And this introduces this dimension of, well, one thing is to get things right. Another thing is to get things together. And that was one issue, I think. Another issue I suspect that was underlying Veronica's comment is this idea that some sort of principles, principles might be abstract enough so that we can't just fill them in unless we attribute some meaning to them. And this attribution of meaning to those principles, then that's practice of attributing some meaning to a principle, so I can interpret it. This practice is not shared practice; it's an individual practice. So I think those are 2 different issues here. I'm not sure if that was clear. Oh yes, of course. What I suspect was underlying Veronica's idea is that principles in general are very abstract. Equality, fraternity, liberty, so on and so forth. Those are too abstract. And in order to be able to interpret them, we need to attribute some meaning, some content to it so that we can interpret it. Otherwise, just having justice or equality or liberty flying on the screen, that will not help us. We need to attribute, we need to lay some meaning, some content to it. And this, I think, is what Veronica was fearing was too individual. And it might be, it might end up being individual, but this is, I think, a different matter than the previous one.
The get things right and get things together. Okay.
Yes.
Do you have a third one?
There was the third one, not important. Those are the two more important ones. The third one, it's.
Okay. So going back to the idea that the shared interpretive practices and the criteria for correct interpretations. And let me just recall the debate with Fish about the interpretive communities. And at the end, this goes into, again, it's not that we are getting it right because one says which is one, but I think it's more like in the communities, appealing to the community's constitutional morality. So who is getting that picture better? So I think it's a collective enterprise, not individual. I think that's a misreading of Dworkin, thinking that he's talking of one judge. The case of Hercules, that was the example as he put it at the first. But what Hercules proved was that there were right answers, not that there was only one person who will reach the right answers. I think it's more like a collective enterprise. So I think for that, going and revisiting Dworkin's Fish exchange, I think is helpful. And again, I think that as you might remember, if you follow the debate, they were very similar talking about literature and how probably there are not right answers in literature, because probably we are about to make more readings about the same text. Whereas in the law, it seems that because of the authoritative nature of law, it is needed to have at some point some decision has been settled. But as I argue in the paper, it's not settled for all time. It's settled for now and be able to revise it and to justify the application of the rule or the change of the criteria. And again, going back to the idea of the principles are too abstract, I now have because of your comment, also the feeling of bringing a Williams-Lucy loss abstract judgment, which I think is a nice way of putting the acknowledging that on one hand, of course, principles are very abstract, but then we have to figure out what is consistent in a more concrete way with this abstract principle. So I'm not sure if that's helpful to dilute a little bit of your criticism on how, of course, if I go into, well, more or less we agree on the abstract, but which concrete way of reaching it is not necessarily, because there's one quotation of Dworkin saying something like that in what I read. But again, I think we might still have the feeling that we are united in the bigger purpose, even though we disagree on how to reach the goals of getting to there. But again, I think we are able to get the abstract principle more concrete and to figure out ways of, and for instance, we defend, I think we must defend the freedom of expression, and then we figure out which are ways of or not. So how far did you want to go in criminalizing people for freedom of speech? I think there's no way, and you have to figure out a way of doing something. But one more thing on the getting things right and getting things together. I guess that's one very nice way of summing up the Waldron's critique to Dworkin. The critique will be like, we don't want only few judges making decisions and getting them right. We want them we want to make the decisions together in the legislative assembly. And so somehow there seems to be a tension there that you're pointing. But again, I think we can try to reach both. How we are going to try to reach the right answers together. And again, I think it's in the part which Ronaldo is agreeing with me through these interpretive shared practices of going back and forth. And I think that's the part of the Protestant. Be willing to go back and forth in figuring out which way is the better way of understanding the principle A or B or C or whatever. So I think that's still a way of getting it into more concrete ways of understanding principles. Okay.
Thank you so much. This clarifies, the conversation is very good. So, but Ime, I didn't say that all this, I didn't attribute to Dworkin, that, you know, the, only the individual.
No, I
Yes,
think
yeah.
it's a
So
common.
I'm just taking it infer from your point. I think your argument in the paper is that the individual can question, because you kept saying, and I think it's a very interesting idea, that the judge is the last word, but it's not the best decision, right? It's a very nice way of putting it. So then therefore you're inviting the citizen. I think my worry is this: you're inviting, I'm not much with Dworkin's legal theory, but with your argument that the citizen can question the judge's decision. And that's my worry.
Okay.
And that's where the Protestant comes, and that's where exactly the point of Daniel as well. So it's the community, the seamless web, all the law agree, we all share a way of correcting, and then the judges is an authority. The other question regarding the citizen is, I think that probably my worry is that this is not a theory of authority, law's empire, right? It's a theory of what the law is, the character of the law as a justification for the coercion of the state. And you're saying, oh, but this coercion can be wrong. They can get it wrong. Yeah. But then you're jumping into the question of authority. And that is my worry, because there is no theory of authority here.
Okay, I think
You understand the disagreement?
I think I now see a point of disagreement. But let me try to suggest that it was somehow related to the paper I'm commenting, which was also talking about that civil disobedience.
Yeah.
And usually the idea of civil disobedience goes into one citizen objecting, or a group of citizens objecting to the way they are applying the law for a certain case. And so I know I again go back, and I see now your worry about allowing the citizens, or even enforcing the citizens, to question everything, like, so nothing will stand. So I see, I will clearly don't want to suggest that's completely what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
What I'm trying to suggest is that, of course, and I think I'm clear on following the quotation of Dworkin on the two principles for political integrity, where he was saying that there's the legislative principle, the lawmakers have to do their part, but then the judges have to do their part, but also other officials who have legal authority have to do their part. But I was trying, and this in this part, to suggest that we also citizens, we also have a role in pushing these actors in those places where there's a popular initiative, presenting a popular initiative, in challenging an statute. So that's the part in which I think we cannot deny that we also as citizens do have some sort of Protestant attitude, because if not, we will abide for any decision, and we actually controvert most of the decisions. So in that sense, again, that's, from my point of view, something that gives more power to the idea of the Protestant attitude, which reflects much more, or much better, the practice that we engage by criticizing the decisions and pushing them all the time.
Okay, that's clear. But then I don't think actually the critical deliberation and the possibility of dialogue is a feature of the Protestant attitude. I don't think that, I think that's not correct.
No, I think you were right that the core is the constant reflection, willing to have whether it is how much dialogue is within there. I think it's not necessarily that part, although I think it's a shared practice and there has to be some sort of dialogue. And I'm a true believer on the idea that there's a dialogue between the courts and legislatures, which I think that's working, but I'm not sure that Jeremy was happy with that idea. Or he tends to see like the tension on allowing the courts to overrule the decisions of the legislature. And again, even if they came to get it right, the thing is that we are together making these decisions. And again, it's not necessarily that we are together. It's a majority in Congress who did that. And I'm not sure we are all together in this in a stronger sense. But yeah, but I think that's a tension with Jeremy. But I have the feeling that Dworkin explains, or at least the Protestant Institute explains, not only the role of the legal officials, but also gives room for citizens to also engage in this call for the Protestant attitude. Which I see your point, on which if anything stands, if nothing stands, that will be crazy. There will be no authority. And I'm not saying, I don't think Dworkin suggests that, nor myself will be willing to push.
Yeah, but I understand your project. You think that from Dworkin's theory of interpretation, we can have a theory of authority.
Yeah, in
This is
sense, I do.
the big picture of your project. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Well, if you allow me to jump in again, this wonderful, very interesting discussion. I'd like to say that, well, in reply to what Daniel said, I think that distinguishing getting things right and getting things together, I think that, well, when you share practice, like speaking an language, you can always say that you share this practice whenever you share the criteria correctness. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to say that you share the use of language, that you can speak a language if you don't share the criteria of correctness. And I think this is essentially and conceptually linked to the very idea of, again, sorry to be too Wittgensteinian, with the idea what is to follow a rule in the general sense. I mean, if is to be able to separate or to distinguish situations in which you are following and which you are not following, in which you are failing to comply with the rule and which you are not. So the concept of correctness come together if you are talking about this kind of practice. So I wouldn't think that this distinction would make much sense in this context. Second, I'd like to say something about the concept. Veronica mentioned this idea of how principles are abstract. Yeah, well, the wording of the principles, the way they are presented in our legislation, of course, is expressed in a very broad general language. However, I think it makes no sense, and I think Dworkin would endorse it, to try to think abstractly what is the meaning of the principle of equality, or what the meaning of the principle of liberty, or whatever. I mean, to have a theory of principle as it was previously imagined being possible according to traditional legal dogmatics. This is the kind of traditional metaphysics he thinks, I think, is absolutely pointless. I mean, if you want to know what is the meaning of equality in our society, it's really useless to torture the text of the Constitution. You have to check what are the shared practices, attitudes that give meaning for our shared understanding of what equality should be, what is the best conceptualization of the concept of equality. So it's always contextual. So I mean, all reflection about the meaning of concepts at the end of the day has to be contextualized. So on this sense, the method, it is, I think it's repellent to some kind of general abstract kind of general theory. It's not Kantian in the sense of, it's not related to creating a kind of general language according to which it will be possible to express what is the essence of these legal principles. I think, though, that this way of understanding the theory of principles, and there's many books published under this title, they aim to do exactly what Dworkin and others think it is an kind of impossible or pointless task. So what is to think about principle? It's not really to reflect in a very abstract. So it's necessarily to connect the possibilities of different meanings that we can assign to this idea into many different contexts. And at the end of the day, the jurist will be the one who will be dealing not with a general theory of principles, but basically about what we should understand as equality or freedom in a specific context, in a very well detailed, very well contextualized situation. And finally, a third point that I don't know exactly if it fits really well with what Veronica and Imer were discussing, but I remember the famous example offered by H.L.A. Hart about the arbitrariness or the discretion of the referee in a game. And we in Brazil, we like to use the example of Maradona's Mano de Dios. Yes. So according to the referee, who made a Protestant interpretation at the time, he was, maybe that's a bad example to say this, but at least he made his decision, acknowledging that that was not a flawed goal. But I mean, even if it's definite, even if his decision was the final one, it was criticized according to the rules of the football because he doesn't own the criteria of what is a goal. And I think that the Catholic, I mean, the metaphor of the Catholic interpretation and the infallibility of the Pope is really connected with the impossibility of the Pope's word being incorrect. I think that the image of a Catholic interpretation is necessarily connected with this idea of infallibility of the Pope's word. That is what he's rejecting. So that's
The practical reason are let me just, I have the quotation of, well, Bishop Benjamin Hoadley. Whoever had an absolute authority to interpret any written or spoken laws it is he who is truly the lawgiver to all intent and purposes, and not the person who first wrote or spoke them. And of course, the Robert Jackson's, we are not final because we are infallible, but we are infallible only because we are final. So again, the idea that the infallibility and being final doesn't give any much about the reasons. But just to react to Maradona's hand, the
Mano de Dios.
Mano de Dios. the fact that he got away with it is clearly someone did not realize that it was a hand. And of course, now we have the VAR, and I will definitely look at it. It was a hand all the way. But again, it's a very nice point to just let me recall the reaction of Dworkin with the discretion. So in this forgotten text of Hart, he repeats what he says in the concept of law about discretion. There's a nice point which I didn't realize till recently, that in the translation to Spanish, discretion by Genaro Carrillo is translated into something like discrecional, not discretion, no discreción. So it shifted from to a more adjective use of the word. So somehow that's tricky, but I think that was helpful for hearts. But anyway, what I'm trying to say on the discretion is, it's either a judgment. It has this sense of the final authority of the whoever has to decide, and of course has the one that Dworkin criticizes of the being something that you have to decide, like elect which one you like more, whereas the law is supposed to be about making applying the law that already is there. And again, going back to this kind of applying the Protestant attitude to figure out which is the judgment you have to provide, taking into account that law has already authority, that you have to be fidel to that authority, and that you have to be coherent throughout time. So I think that's part of what I think is the beauty of, and I think the Maradona hand will not stand that test for long.
Okay, well, I think Professor Weber might be really tired because he arrived today very early in the morning, has given other conference, has been speaking until now, had a very cool, cold glass of beer. So I think it's more than time to stop here. I'd like to thank you, Professor Emer. It's always a pleasure, always a great opportunity for us to discuss your ideas. And I think it's time now to prepare for tomorrow's conference that will be given by Professor Veronica. Thank you very much for everybody and for those who are attending online.
Muchas gracias por todo.